Hello, it's Andy Parks from the Washington Times, and I'll be checking in with Stephen Dinan, Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, in just a minute. You know, as a listener to my podcast, you qualify to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Simply go to washingtontimes.com/Andy. That's washingtontimes.com/ANDY. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here is Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Andy.
Critical race theory takes aim at immigration law. Courts wrestle with Hispanic disparity in cases. I got to be honest with you. I thought this critical race theory stuff went away quietly during the night, but I guess not.
It's a really interesting case. And so the critical race theory folks have won a pretty surprising victory. Earlier this year, and a judge in Nevada ruled that a section of law governing illegal immigrants who have been deported and try and sneak back in. It's known as Section 1326 of Title 8 of the U.S. Code, and it governs illegal reentry. And it's a felony penalty if you have been deported and try and sneak back in. A judge in Nevada ruled that has racist antecedents, that it was created, the first illegal reentry statute was created in 1929 by a Congress that she says had racist motives. It was updated in 1952 and then again 4 or 5 times in the 80s and 90s. In the 1952 update, she says that Congress still had racist motives. In the 80s and 90s, when it was updated, they never officially repudiated the racism of the 1920s and 1950s. And because they have never officially repudiated that racism that she says was inherent in the law's creation, that makes the statute unconstitutional. That, plus the fact that most of the people who are charged under this section of the law for illegally re-entering the country are Hispanic. And so she says that's a racial disparity that basically proves the discriminatory intent of the law. Now, there are a whole bunch of different things to say about that. Number one is that to view the racial disparity in the illegal reentry, but not to take the next step and view the racial disparities in who's actually coming. 85, 90% of the people coming were from Mexico or Central America, i.e., almost all of those people Hispanic. So of course, 90% of your prosecutions are going to be of Hispanics. Is it proof of racist intent or a racist law? Our southern border and is Mexico, and just below that are a bunch of Central American countries whose populations are Hispanic, and for whom the economics make coming to the U.S. just an obvious choice. That's number one argument. Number two is this concept that anytime anytime the administration wants to enforce a law, Congress must have proactively grappled with any racist antecedents. Where do you draw the line? I actually in the story mentioned this interesting example, the Gun Control Act of 1968 and subsequent other gun control acts. There's a lot of scholarly literature that says that gun control is a means of keeping guns out of the hands of Black residents, and in particular, the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. The Gun Control Act of 1968 had a lot to do with the Black Panthers and their penchant for being armed and wanting armed uprising. Does that mean that gun control laws are too racist to survive constitutional scrutiny? If the judge is right about the immigration law, then that may be the next to go, or a gun control law. So a lot of interesting questions that are raised by this ruling. The final thing to say about it is that there's currently an appeal. The Justice Department, the Biden administration Justice Department, has actually appealed the judge's ruling, arguing, no, we have to keep this illegal reentry statute. This is very important and it's not racist. That puts them on the same side as all the immigration restriction groups, the Immigration Reform Law Institute, which is sort of interesting bedfellows. I can't imagine that the judge's ruling survives the appeals court process. But if it does, it raises a whole bunch of interesting questions about how far we can apply critical race theory and what other laws fall next.
All right. Now, in addition to that, I see us spending a great deal of money on federal prosecutors.
they're very busy with this when they should be going after drug dealers, smugglers, fraudsters, right?
So yeah, this is one of the interesting things, and this is, the data came out after the judge made her ruling about the disparate impact, but the Bureau of Justice Statistics finally did some data last month, I guess it was in November, where they actually reported on federal prosecutions and who's getting prosecuted and for what crimes. And it turns out that the most numerous prosecution that federal prosecutors bring is for this charge, illegal reentry. It's 36% of all federal cases brought in 2018 were for illegal immigrants reentering. And if you add in illegal entry and smuggling cases, you're talking about more than 40% of all federal prosecutorial work, 80,000 some odd cases brought that year were for immigration offenses. By contrast, drug trafficking is only 16% of federal cases. So this one charge, illegal reentry, and the prosecutions for it dominates federal prosecutors, in particular in border areas. They're just track the courts, the federal district courts along the border, and every day it's just there are dozens, if not some days multiple dozens of cases of 1326 illegal reentry are filed on people. It's a powerful way to sort of add extra teeth to what normally would happen is they'd just be deported. This allows you to actually not just deport them, but before you deport them, you stick them in jail or prison for 6 months. And the whole theory behind that is if they came for jobs and they're not working, they're stuck in jail not working, and they came to work and sort of support their families back home, and they're stuck in prison for 6 months, they aren't working. Well, they're not going to try it again because that 6 months is time and money that they can't lose to the prison system. That's the theory behind the law, and it'd be really interesting to see if this judge's ruling stands and federal prosecutors can no longer bring that charge, and we have that deterrent.
All right, I'm going to take you to another one of your stories. Fight to clean voter list gains ground after 2020 election. So now we're going to clean things up. What generated that, and why not before the 2020 election?
It's a good question. Why not before? There's some sense that things were just so political, and this is really complicated. And President Trump has, in some ways, he's shown a bright light on election system and some real problems in the election system. He's also, though, obfuscated a lot of what goes on with elections with some of the more outlandish claims he's made about machines, mass switching votes and that sort of stuff. Any election official and anybody who's involved in sort of watching elections intently over the last decades or so will tell you that elections are run mechanically, but they are not, I would say they're an approximation. They're an approximation of what those who turned up to vote actually intended to vote. Because every election, there are issues with ballots that are lost, ballots that are mishandled but still counted, ballots that are perhaps double counted. There's probably not a single election of any sort of substantial size where there isn't some irregularity. One of the problems with elections, we know, is that there are dirty voter rolls where there are just names of hundreds, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dead people on states' voter roll. Dead people, and then people who've moved out of the jurisdiction. So people who they could turn up and vote, but they aren't supposed to because they're either dead or they don't actually live in that jurisdiction anymore. And in every election, you still have some of those people actually having ballots cast for them. The push towards mail voting makes that dirty voter rolls issue very, very, very important, because if suddenly you have a live ballot sent out to every single person on those rolls, then there are people. You have a live ballot that was sent to Jane Smith, who died 6 months ago, but a ballot arrives at her house, and say her husband's like, well, I know what Jane would have voted, so I'm just going to fill it out for Jane. Hey, I just voted twice. I voted for me and I voted for my wife. We actually have an example of exactly that happening in Pennsylvania,
Wow.
which is part of what the story was about. In Pennsylvania, a man actually registered his dead wife years after she died. He registered her and then went ahead and cast a ballot for her. At least that criminal charge that's been brought against him is doing that. So, this all goes back to the more we get away from people showing up on election day, going into a booth and casting a ballot, the more we get away from that, the more these issues of dirty voter rolls and election integrity checks and balances come into play. So the generous way to answer your question is, as we've moved towards mail voting, local election officials realize that they need to keep their voter rolls clean if they want to maintain public confidence in the vote. The more cynical view of your question of why now is President Trump made such a big stink over elections. This is the easiest thing that those local folks can do, and then point to and say, hey, we took some action, get off our back. Mm-hmm. Which of those answers, I don't know, but as long as they're taking the action, I guess, there's something there that's good.
All right, folks, you can read all of Stephen Dinan's stories at WashingtonTimes.com. Before I let you go, Harry Reid passed away. Now, I know that you've had some dealings with him off and on over the past, 15, 20 years. What do you think?
I actually didn't write an obituary for him. That's actually not true. I started one a few years back just in preparation. He was in the middle of a 4-year battle with pancreatic cancer. So I started an obituary and never completed it for a number of different reasons. But when I was writing it, there were two different things I was going to go with, possible tops to the story. One was just calling him, he's clearly one of the most consequential senators of the last century or so. He left the Senate between blowing up the filibuster for using the nuclear option to blow up the filibuster for presidential nominations, to his own use of the filibuster repeatedly, including filibustering the very judges under President Bush that he then went and said, no, you can't filibuster anymore under President Obama. All sorts of different rules and traditions that he broke in the Senate. He left the Senate a different place. A senator who'd served from, say, 1970 to 1990 would not recognize the Senate that Harry Reid left us with. And, that's, for good or bad, that's an important legacy. He absolutely changed the Senate into, in some ways, the partisan mess that it is now. But the other thing about Harry Reid, a very important story about him. Back in 2012, Mitt Romney, Reidism was a Mormon, Mitt Romney a Mormon, so an interesting sort of religious issue here. Mitt Romney was the Republican presidential nominee, and Harry Reid came out very prominently and declared, I know for a fact Mitt Romney didn't pay tax, that he didn't, he basically used all these tax shelters. It's not that he cheated, he had zero tax liability. He didn't end up paying any taxes because of all the shelters and ways that he was hiding his income. It became a major issue for Mitt Romney, and he had to deal with that during the campaign. Later on, it came out, Mitt Romney's actual finances came out, and it turned out that he did in fact pay taxes. And when Reid was later confronted with that, his only defense was, well, i.e., I kept Mitt Romney from winning the White House, thanks in part to my telling mistruths about his taxes. That encapsulates Harry Reid. There are few rules that Harry Reid abided by when it came to advancing what Harry Reid wanted to do. For good or bad, he was a win now, win my way, win at all costs sort of guy. That was Harry Reid. He had an amazing personal story, rising literally sort of rags to top of a Washington power story. And part of it is because of that attitude. Win now, win my way, win at any cost. The Senate we see today is a result of that.
Stephen, as always, thank you. Have a great New Year. We'll talk again.
Happy New Year to you, Andy.
Washington Times Assistant Managing Editor, Stephen Dinan. Thanks for joining me today, and remember to receive a 50% discount on an annual digital subscription to the Washington Times. Go to WashingtonTimes.com/Andy. You'll get 24/7 digital access to the Washington Times at 50% off. Again, go to WashingtonTimes.com/ANDY. I'm Andy Parks. Have a great day and Happy New Year.